Brandon sat comfortably in the living room of his luxurious home, slowly sipping his morning coffee on a quiet Sunday. He turned on the TV, ready to relax and enjoy the start of his day. The moment the screen lit up, he nearly spat out the mouthful of coffee he had just taken. His ex-wife, the woman he had divorced 2 years ago, was being featured on a television program highlighting the most promising startup founders in the region. Brandon stared at the screen in disbelief. 2 years ago, he had thrown Sarah out of his life with nothing but a small suitcase. She had left without $1 to her name, without a job, and without anyone to rely on. Yet somehow, she had not only survived, she had become successful enough to appear on national television. A surge of anger rushed through him. He couldn't understand how she had managed to rebuild her life without him. In a fit of rage, Brandon hurled his coffee mug straight at the TV. The screen shattered with a loud crash. He collapsed onto the sofa, staring blankly ahead. Sweat began forming on his forehead as his face twisted with shock, jealousy, and fury. After returning from a 3-day business trip, Brandon came home to find that Sarah had already prepared dinner with all of his favorite dishes. "You're home. Go take a shower and come downstairs for dinner," she said warmly. Brandon gave her a cold glance before silently heading upstairs. Sarah stood there, confused, unable to understand what had happened. She assumed that something unpleasant must have occurred during his trip. A little while later, Brandon came back downstairs, and the two of them sat together at the dining table. The atmosphere during dinner was much quieter than usual. Unable to bear the silence any longer, Sarah finally spoke up. "What's wrong? Did your business trip not go well?" "Every other trip has always been fine. You can tell me if something happened." In response, Brandon simply looked at her with a cold expression and said curtly, "Just focus on eating." Although Sarah felt deeply hurt, she could do nothing except wonder what she had done wrong. The two of them continued eating in complete silence, feeling more like strangers sharing a table than husband and wife. After dinner, Sarah cleaned up the dishes and noticed Brandon sitting on the sofa, staring at her with the same cold expression. She immediately sensed that he had something important to say. Even though panic was rising inside her, she tried to remain calm and walked over to sit beside him. "Sarah, I want a divorce. I'm tired of this marriage. I've tried to save our relationship for a long time, but my feelings have continued to fade. And there's someone else I've been seeing." Sarah gripped the apron she was still wearing as tears suddenly rolled down her cheeks. Her voice trembled as she asked, "What did I do wrong? I've sacrificed everything to take care of this family." Brandon frowned in irritation. "Look at yourself. You dress like a mess. You've become less attractive every year. What man wouldn't get tired of a woman like you? You don't know how to make money either. Other than cooking, what can you actually do? Anyway, I've already prepared the divorce papers. They'll be on the table. Sign them and move out in a few days." After delivering those words like knives aimed directly at her heart, Brandon coldly stood up and walked away without another glance. Sarah remained sitting there with her head lowered as tears continued soaking her shirt. Even though she still loved Brandon, she refused to beg him to stay. Her self-respect would never allow anyone to humiliate her like that. She quietly walked upstairs to look at the divorce papers he had prepared. Inside the bedroom, there was only her and the divorce agreement resting on the table. This room had once been their private space filled with love and happiness, but now it felt cold and terrifyingly empty. Sarah looked at the framed wedding photo sitting nearby and gave it a faint smile, perhaps the last smile she would ever give to that relationship. Then she gently turned the photograph face down and signed the divorce papers. Brandon had not left her a single piece of property. It was abandonment in its cruelest form. At that moment, Sarah no longer cared about money or possessions. Everything inside her heart had already been shattered. All of her belongings could fit into a single small suitcase. She had spent her youth taking care of Brandon without ever thinking about herself. Sarah quickly packed her things and left, not giving herself time to think. She simply wanted to get away from that house as fast as possible. For the first time, she realized she had begun to feel disgust toward Brandon. Before leaving, she turned around and looked at the house one final time. Then she faced forward again and walked away without looking back. Sarah walked away without hesitation. She wandered through the city with no idea where she would sleep that night. She had no close friends, and for years her entire life had revolved around Brandon, leaving her with no one she could turn to for help. Then she remembered the park she often visited whenever she needed fresh air. There were long benches there where she could rest. Pulling her small suitcase behind her, Sarah made her way to the park and lay down on one of the benches. She was too exhausted to think any further about her future. Little by little, she drifted off to sleep. The next morning, she woke up to find the park already filled with people exercising and jogging. Some glanced at her with judgment and disdain, unable to understand why a young woman would be sleeping alone on a park bench. But Sarah no longer cared what anyone thought of her. She picked up her suitcase and continued on her way. Fortunately, no one had stolen it during the night. At that moment, the most valuable thing Sarah owned was the gold bracelet her mother had given her before she passed away. With no money left and nowhere else to turn, she headed to the nearest secondhand jewelry shop in the city. Standing in front of the buying counter, she hesitated for a long time. Well, are you selling it or not? If not, move aside and let other customers through, the heavy-set man behind the counter said impatiently. Sarah startled and looked down at the bracelet on her wrist one last time. Tears slowly rolled down her cheeks as the reality hit her. She was about to sell the final keepsake her mother had left behind. The pain and humiliation of losing the last piece of her mother felt almost unbearable. Sarah grew up in a poor town on the outskirts of Dallas. Her life was filled with hardship from an early age. When she was only 3 years old, her father died in a workplace accident. From that moment on, she was raised entirely by her mother. Because their family struggled financially, Sarah was forced to leave school after the 10th grade to help support the household. Her mother was heartbroken by the decision but had no other choice. Together, they took on every job they could find, from cleaning houses and washing dishes to making deliveries. Despite their difficult lives, mother and daughter remained happy because they believed that as long as they had each other, they had enough. Another tragedy struck when Sarah was 15 years old. Her mother was diagnosed with brain cancer. The devastating news, combined with her constant worry about Sarah's future, caused her condition to worsen quickly. The family was far too poor to afford proper treatment. Eventually, Sarah's mother became bedridden, and every responsibility fell onto Sarah's shoulders. She worked from morning until night while also caring for her mother. Every day, she rode her bicycle to work, then rushed home at lunchtime to check on her mother before returning to work again. Watching her daughter sacrifice so much only made her mother feel more guilty and heartbroken, which seemed to make her illness even worse. One night, while Sarah was gently wiping her mother's forehead, something unusual happened. Her mother suddenly seemed stronger than she had been in months. She reached for Sarah's hand and held it tightly. "Sarah, my sweet girl, thank you for being our daughter. You've always been kind, loving, and devoted. You deserve a better life than the one you've been given." Sarah was shocked because her mother had been too weak to speak clearly for a very long time. Yet at that moment, she almost looked healthy again. Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she hugged her mother. "Mom, you're finally getting better. From now on, we'll keep fighting together. As long as I'm with you, I'm happy. Please stay with me for a long time." Her mother embraced her and cried softly. "No matter what happens, I want you to know that you are the greatest gift God ever gave your father and me. If there is another life after this one, I promise we'll give you a happier and more comfortable life." Then she removed the gold bracelet from her wrist and placed it into Sarah's hands. "This bracelet was given to me by your grandmother when your father and I got married. Now I'm giving it to you. Take good care of it. Let it protect you, and whenever you wear it, remember that I'll always be with you." Before Sarah could give it back, her mother had already fallen asleep from exhaustion. Sarah smiled as she watched her sleep peacefully, believing that her mother was finally getting better. She had no idea that her mother had used the very last of her strength to give her those final words and that final gift. The next morning, Sarah entered the room carrying a bowl of soup and tried to wake her mother. But she quickly realized that her mother was no longer breathing. A peaceful smile rested on her lips. Sarah's heart shattered. "No! Mom, please! You were getting better! You promised you'd stay with me! Why would you leave me alone?" She threw herself beside the bed, crying as she held her mother's body in her arms. Somehow, even in those final moments, she felt as though her mother's warmth was still there. After spending one last day with her mother, washing her and dressing her in one of her favorite outfits, Sarah contacted a funeral home and arranged the funeral. She spent nearly every dollar she had to cover the costs. During the service, Sarah stood in front of her mother's portrait with swollen, bloodshot eyes. She had cried until she had no tears left. Holding the photograph close, she rested her forehead against it the same way she had rested against her mother's shoulder as a child. "Mom, I'll live a happy life, so please don't worry about me. When you see Dad again, tell him I miss him too." In the next life, let's be a family again. A few days later, Sarah gave up the small house filled with memories of her parents and left the town behind. She knew that if she stayed, the pain would consume her forever. At only 15 years old, Sarah arrived in the city alone. She was thin, undernourished, and looked younger than her age, making it difficult for anyone to hire her. After selling nearly everything she owned, she was left with only a few $100s. Desperate to survive, she accepted any job that paid money, no matter how difficult or unpleasant it was. She rented a tiny room in a rundown building for low-income workers. The room was barely large enough to live in, and she had to share facilities with strangers. Yet Sarah remained optimistic because she had promised her mother she would live a happy life. She cleaned buildings, washed dishes, delivered packages, and took on countless other jobs just to make ends meet. 3 years passed. Sarah slowly built a better life for herself. She moved into a slightly larger apartment and found steadier work with better pay. During this period, she met Brandon, a young man who had come from a small town to attend college. The two met by chance at an inexpensive cafe on a Sunday morning and quickly became attracted to each other. Sarah believed Brandon would be the person who would finally bring happiness into her life. She worked even harder and shared her income with him so he could focus on his studies without worrying about money. Thanks to her support, Brandon graduated with good grades. After college, Sarah continued standing beside him, encouraging him and helping him through the early years of his career at a small company. For 9 years, she supported him, sacrificed for him, and believed in him. And now, after all those years, she had been betrayed by the man she devoted her entire youth to. Standing inside the jewelry shop, Sarah broke down in tears, forgetting that anyone else was even there. The shop owner looked at her sympathetically. "Miss, I can tell this bracelet means a lot to you. It's probably worth around $600, but I'll give you $1,000, and I'll keep it safe. If you ever have the money, you can come back and buy it again." Sarah grabbed his hand with tears streaming down her face. "Please keep it for me. My mother gave it to me before she died. I promised I would protect it. I'll come back for it as soon as I can." She left the store in tears. At the very same moment, Brandon stretched lazily in bed as though he had done nothing wrong. He expected Sarah to have signed the divorce papers and be preparing to leave. In fact, he had already planned ways to make her life difficult if she refused. When he entered the bedroom and found that she had already left, he felt nothing but satisfaction. He noticed their wedding photo lying face down on the table and didn't care in the slightest. Lying back on the bed, he smirked. What an idiot. She should have demanded something for herself. But that's exactly who she is. Makes everything easier for me. He had never intended to leave Sarah any assets. Even if she had asked for something, he would have made things as difficult as possible. To Brandon, the years Sarah spent sacrificing for him were simply something she was supposed to do. Feeling victorious, he called the woman he had secretly been seeing for nearly a year. The truth was that Brandon had been cheating long before the divorce. Many of his so-called business trips had actually been excuses to spend time with his mistress. "Baby, I finally got rid of my wife. Come over later. Let's celebrate." As Brandon looked forward to his new life with a younger woman, 7 years of dating and 2 years of marriage officially came to an end for Brandon and Sarah. Being betrayed by the person she loved did not destroy Sarah's will to keep going. Instead, it strengthened her determination to build a better life because she had promised her mother that she would live without regrets. She rented another rundown apartment similar to the one she had lived in years ago and started over from nothing. After cleaning the small room, Sarah smiled and quietly prayed that one day she would find the happiness she had always dreamed of. The following morning, she began searching for a job, but the difficulties quickly became apparent. At 27 years old, finding work was much harder than she expected. Many of the jobs she had done in the past, such as washing dishes and cleaning, had become automated. Other available jobs were managed through apps and often preferred hiring men. For several days, Sarah went from one place to another looking for work, but every application ended in rejection. Most employers preferred younger workers, especially college students. Even when Sarah offered to work for lower wages, nobody was willing to hire her. One afternoon, after being rejected yet again by a restaurant where she had applied for a cleaning position, Sarah walked home feeling defeated. As she passed a small bakery on a street corner, she caught the scent of freshly baked bread. The smell instantly reminded her of the cakes her mother used to make when she was a child. Curious, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The bakery was small, containing only a display counter, a kitchen area, and a few tables and chairs. Yet it felt warm, cozy, and welcoming. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged woman about the same age her mother would have been, with a kind smile on her face. "Hello there, sweetheart. We just baked a fresh batch." "What would you like today?" the woman asked warmly. Sarah smiled softly. "I was just passing by, and the smell reminded me of the cakes my mother used to make. I'd like one of those sponge cakes, please." She pointed to a cake displayed at the front of the counter. The woman laughed gently. "Then I hope you'll enjoy it and come back again. By the way, my name is Leona. What's yours?" "I'm Sarah," she replied, "and I'm sure I'll be back." After buying the cake, Sarah thanked Leona and headed for the door. Before leaving, she glanced back and saw Leona still waving goodbye to her. It had been years since her mother's death. Sarah felt warmth from another woman. There was something about Leona that felt strangely familiar, almost like family. Back in her small apartment, Sarah slowly ate the cake. The moment she tasted it, tears filled her eyes. It tasted so much like the cakes her mother used to bake that memories came rushing back all at once. She sat there eating and crying at the same time, unable to stop thinking about her mother. When she finally finished, she rested her head on the table and drifted off to sleep. It was the best sleep she had had in a very long time. A week passed since Sarah had started looking for work. She applied everywhere she could think of, but no one was willing to hire her. The few places that did offer her a position turned out to be illegal or unethical jobs, so she refused them. One afternoon, after being rejected once again, Sarah found herself returning to the bakery. She hoped that seeing Leona again might lift her spirits, even if only a little. As she stepped inside, she was startled to find Leona lying on the floor near the kitchen area. Sarah immediately rushed over and helped her sit up. "Ma'am, are you okay? Should I call an ambulance?" Leona quickly shook her head. "Sarah? Don't worry, sweetheart. I just slipped and fell while cleaning the floor. That's all." Sarah carefully helped her onto a nearby chair. "How long have you been down there? Didn't any customers see you?" Leona smiled weakly. "Only about 10 or 15 minutes. Besides, this bakery doesn't get many customers these days." As Sarah looked closer, she noticed that Leona's left wrist was swollen. "Does your wrist hurt? It looks swollen." Leona touched it with her other hand and immediately winced. "Oh dear, I must have landed on it when I fell. It's probably sprained. I don't even know how I'm going to run the bakery tomorrow." Sarah interrupted her gently. "You should worry about your health first. Do you have a first aid kit? Let me take a look." Leona pointed her toward a cabinet. Sarah quickly gathered the supplies and began wrapping the injured wrist with practiced hands. Leona watched in surprise. "Are you a nurse or something? You look like you've done this before." Sarah smiled while finishing the bandage. "My mother was sick for a long time. I spent years taking care of her, so I learned a few things." Leona nodded warmly. "Your mother was lucky to have a daughter like you. Is she doing better now?" The smile disappeared from Sarah's face. "No, ma'am. She passed away not long ago." Leona's expression immediately changed. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have asked." She gently hugged Sarah. Sarah shook her head. "It's okay. You didn't know." After a moment, Leona asked another question. "So what are you doing these days?" Sarah rubbed the back of her neck awkwardly. "I just moved here. I've been looking for a job, but nobody will hire me." Leona thought for a moment before suddenly smiling. "Then why don't you come work for me? My wrist is hurt, and you seem like a quick learner. If I teach you, I'm sure you'll learn quickly." Sarah's eyes widened. She had spent years cooking while living with Brandon, and she genuinely enjoyed baking and preparing food. This was the first opportunity anyone had offered her in weeks. "I'd love that. Thank you." The rest of the afternoon passed with the two women talking and getting to know each other. Although they were complete strangers with no blood relation, the atmosphere between them felt remarkably similar to that of a mother and daughter. For Sarah, a new chapter of her life had finally begun. The next morning, Sarah woke up very early. The morning sunlight filtered through the small window of her worn-down apartment. She sat up, looked around the room, and smiled to herself. It wasn't a nice place to live. In fact, it was cramped and falling apart. But for the first time in weeks, She felt like her life was finally moving in a direction again. After getting ready, Sarah quickly headed to the bakery. From a distance, she could already see Leona standing outside the front door. The older woman immediately waved when she spotted her. "Good morning, sweetheart." Sarah laughed and walked over. "Good morning, Miss Leona." Leona opened the door. "I just finished baking the first batch. Come inside before they get cold." The rich aroma of butter and fresh bread quickly filled the small bakery. Sarah took a deep breath and felt an unexpected sense of peace. Over the following days, Leona began teaching her every part of the business, from measuring ingredients, to beating eggs, to preparing dough, and even controlling the temperature of the ovens. Sarah learned quickly. Whenever there was something she didn't understand, she carefully wrote it down in a small notebook. During the day, she helped serve customers. In the evenings, she stayed behind to learn more. Some nights, long after the bakery had closed, the kitchen lights were still on. Leona often had to remind her, "Sarah, go home and get some rest. You don't have to work this hard." But Sarah would simply smile. "I enjoy it." And she truly did. In that moment in many years, she had found work that genuinely made her happy. Not because of the money, but because she found joy in doing it. One afternoon, Leona happened to stop outside the kitchen and watched Sarah carefully decorating a tray of small cakes. The older woman's expression gradually softened. Without realizing it, she found herself thinking about her son. If she had ever been blessed with a daughter, she imagined she might have been a lot like Sarah. Ever since Sarah started working at the bakery, the little shop that had once felt quiet and lonely seemed much warmer and livelier. Time passed, and Leona's wrist slowly healed. But instead of taking back all of her old responsibilities, she began giving Sarah more and more authority. One morning she smiled and said, "Starting today, you're in charge of the baking." Sarah stared at her in surprise. "Me?" Leona laughed. "If not you, then who?" Sarah hesitated. "But what if the cakes don't turn out well? Then you'll make another batch." Leona gently patted her on the head. "Years ago, I ruined hundreds of cakes before I was able to open this bakery." Sarah looked at the woman standing in front of her and couldn't help smiling. It was the most genuine smile she had shown in a very long time. In the days that followed, Sarah took full responsibility for baking. She never stopped learning. She spent hours online studying new recipes, watching famous pastry chefs demonstrate techniques, and experimenting with different ingredients. Some creations turned out wonderfully. Others ended up in the trash. But Sarah never became discouraged. She simply kept trying again. Little by little, the bakery's menu became more diverse. New flavors appeared. Unique pastries that Leona had never made before began filling the display cases. Customers started noticing the changes. One customer recommended the bakery to a friend. Then that friend brought someone else. Gradually, the number of customers increased. The growth wasn't dramatic, but it was steady. Every week seemed slightly better than the one before. For both Sarah and Leona, it was enough to make them smile and feel hopeful about the future. One weekend evening, as the two women were preparing to close the bakery, Leona's phone suddenly rang. The moment she saw the caller's name on the screen, her face lit up with excitement. "My son is calling," she said happily. Sarah smiled. "He's the one living in Canada, right?" Leona nodded. "That's right. It's been almost a year since he last came home." After spending a few minutes talking on the phone, Leona hung up and turned towards Sarah. "He says he's coming back next week for a few days." Sarah's face brightened immediately. "That's wonderful. You must miss him a lot." Leona looked at her and smiled in a way Sarah didn't quite understand. "Yes, I miss him very much." But deep down, Leona was thinking about something entirely different. Perhaps it was finally time for Sarah to meet Caleb. She couldn't explain why, but she had always felt that the day those two met would change both of their lives forever. A week later, Sarah arrived at the bakery one morning and found Leona standing in front of a mirror, carefully fixing her silver hair. "Are you going somewhere today?" Sarah asked with a laugh. Leona turned around and smiled. "Caleb is coming home today." Those 4 words alone were enough for Sarah to see how excited she was. Throughout the day, Leona kept glancing at the clock. Every so often, she adjusted the tablecloths. Then she rearranged the flowers outside the bakery. Then she wiped down the display counter again. Sarah couldn't help laughing. "I don't think he'll notice all of that." Leona pretended to look serious. "He will. He only comes home once a year. I want him to see that his mother is doing well." Late that afternoon, a black car slowly pulled up in front of the bakery. Leona practically rushed to the door. A tall man stepped out of the vehicle. He wore a simple button-down shirt and dark jeans. His appearance was calm and approachable. The moment he saw Leona, he opened his arms and hugged her. "Mom." Leona's eyes immediately became misty. "You finally decided to come home." Sarah stood inside the bakery, watching the scene, and found herself smiling. It reminded her of the days she still had her own mother. After talking for several minutes, Leona finally led Caleb inside. "Let me introduce you. This is Sarah. She's been helping me run the bakery." Caleb turned toward her. At that moment, their eyes met. Sarah extended her hand first. "Nice to meet you. I'm Sarah." Caleb shook her hand. "Caleb?" For a brief moment, neither of them said anything else. Yet somehow, Caleb found it difficult to look away. It wasn't because she was exceptionally beautiful, nor because she stood out in any obvious way. There was simply a peacefulness about her that was difficult to explain. It was something he rarely found in his busy life. That evening, Leona deliberately convinced Caleb to stay for dinner. Sarah cooked while Leona helped where she could. Caleb sat nearby, quietly observing everything around him. He noticed that every time Leona tried to carry something heavy, Sarah was already there to help before she could ask. Every time Leona forgot to take her medication, Sarah gently reminded her. Every time a customer walked through the door, Sarah was the first to greet them with a warm smile. They were small things, simple things. Yet Caleb noticed every single one of them. Later that night, after returning home, Leona was making tea when she suddenly asked, "What do you think of Sarah?" Caleb nearly choked. "What do you mean?" Leona laughed. "I'm just asking." Caleb remained silent for a few seconds before answering. "I think she's a good person." A satisfied smile appeared on Leona's face. She knew her son better than anyone. Over the years, no matter how many people he met, Caleb had never voluntarily offered an opinion like that about anyone. During the rest of his vacation, Caleb seemed to spend more and more time at the bakery. Sometimes he would replace a broken light bulb. Other times he would inspect the electrical system or help Leona move supplies into storage. At first, Sarah assumed he was simply trying to help his mother. Then one afternoon, she walked into the kitchen and found Caleb sitting alone, eating a cake she had been about to throw away. Sarah laughed. "What are you doing?" Caleb looked down at the misshapen cake in his hand. "Eating cake." Sarah shook her head. "That one didn't turn out right. I think it tastes fine." Sarah laughed again. "You're a terrible liar." Caleb smiled. "All right, it's not as good as the others." He paused before continuing. "But I didn't want to see you upset over a cake." For the first time since her divorce, Sarah felt something stir inside her heart. It wasn't because of sweet words or grand gestures. It was because of the sincerity behind what he said. A few days later, Caleb's vacation came to an end. It was time for him to return to Canada. That morning, Leona hugged her son tightly outside the bakery. Sarah stood nearby, watching quietly. For reasons she couldn't explain, she felt a small sense of disappointment. Before getting into the car, Caleb turned toward her. "I'll be back." Sarah smiled politely. "Have a safe trip." The car slowly disappeared around the corner. Sarah returned to the bakery counter and continued working. Yet throughout the entire morning, she caught herself glancing toward the front door several times without realizing it. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, Caleb sat by the window of his flight back to Canada, staring at the clouds drifting past. For the first time in many years, he found himself wondering whether he really wanted to spend the rest of his life living so far away from home. Life gradually returned to its familiar rhythm. Every morning, Sarah arrived at the bakery early. Together, she and Leona prepared ingredients, baked pastries, and served customers. Yet sometimes, during quiet moments when her mind wandered, she found herself thinking about Caleb. She remembered their brief conversations. She remembered the way he quietly helped others without ever expecting recognition. Most of all, she remembered the gentle look in his eyes whenever he spoke to his mother. Sarah quickly pushed those thoughts aside. She refused to let herself think too much about him. After everything Brandon had done, she no longer had the courage to open her heart to anyone again. Meanwhile, in Canada, Caleb wasn't doing much better. His work was still demanding. His salary was still excellent. His life was still stable. Yet for reasons he couldn't explain, he often found himself thinking about the little bakery on that corner in Dallas. He thought about the woman whose hands were always dusted with flour. He thought about Sarah's gentle smile. One evening, while attending a meeting with coworkers, Caleb unexpectedly received a call from Leona. "Mom?" he answered. On the other end of the line came a cheerful laugh. "Don't worry, I'm fine. Sarah made a new cake today, and it's absolutely delicious," Caleb chuckled. "You called me just to tell me that?" "Why not?" Leona replied. "My son spends all day working. Somebody has to tell him something pleasant once in a while." After that conversation, Caleb found himself calling home more often. At first, he only spoke with Leona. But gradually, Sarah became part of those conversations too. What started as a few polite exchanges slowly grew into longer discussions. Sometimes the three of them would spend nearly an hour talking together. Time passed. One day, Leona had a routine medical checkup scheduled. Sarah immediately took the morning off to accompany her. While they sat together in the waiting room, Leona suddenly turned toward her. "What if someone truly loved you?" Sarah froze. "That's a strange question," Leona smiled. "Just answer it." Sarah lowered her gaze and stared at her hands. After a long silence, she finally replied, "I don't know. I think I'd be afraid." Leona sighed softly. Not every man is like Brandon. Sarah didn't answer, but those words stayed in her mind for the rest of the day. About 6 months later, Sarah was busy baking when Leona suddenly rushed into the kitchen. "Sarah! Someone wants to see you!" Confused, Sarah walked out front and immediately stopped in her tracks. Caleb was standing at the entrance of the bakery holding a bouquet of sunflowers. She couldn't hide her surprise. "You're back?" Caleb nodded. "Yeah." Then he smiled. "For good." Sarah blinked. "For good?" Before Caleb could explain, Leona excitedly interrupted. "He quit his job in Canada." Sarah was so shocked that she couldn't speak. Caleb had a great career. He earned a high salary and lived a stable life. She had never imagined he would walk away from all of it. That evening, after the bakery had closed, Sarah and Caleb sat together outside. A cool breeze drifted through the quiet street. After a long silence, Sarah finally asked, "Did you really quit your job?" Caleb nodded. "I did." "Why?" He looked down the road before answering. "I realized I was making a lot of money, but I wasn't spending enough time with the people who mattered. My mother is getting older every year. I don't want to wake up one day full of regrets." Sarah sat quietly. More than anyone, she understood exactly what he meant. If she had been given more time with her own mother, she would have made the same choice. From the day Caleb moved back to Dallas, he began stopping by the bakery after work. Not constantly, just often enough. Sometimes he would sit and drink coffee for 15 minutes before leaving. Sometimes he would help Sarah clean up. Other times he would bring Leona a small potted plant. Everything happened naturally. No one talked about love. No one pressured anyone. Yet it was precisely that peaceful simplicity that made Sarah feel comfortable around him. One weekend evening, a heavy rainstorm swept through the city. The last customer had just left the bakery. Sarah locked the front door and was about to head home when she realized she had forgotten her umbrella. At that exact moment, a car pulled up outside. Caleb stepped out into the rain. "Good timing," he said. Sarah looked surprised. "What are you doing here?" Caleb held up his phone. "My mom called. She said you were still at the bakery." Sarah couldn't help smiling. It had been years since anyone cared whether she got home safely. Years since anyone worried if she worked late. And now someone had driven across town through a storm just to make sure she wasn't alone. It had been years since her marriage had fallen apart. The walls around Sarah's heart began to crack. And perhaps the most surprising part was that she didn't even realize it yet. Time passed more quickly than Sarah expected. Since Caleb moved back to Dallas, her life had gradually begun to change in subtle ways. The long, lonely days of returning to an empty apartment no longer felt quite the same. She no longer carried the feeling that she had to shoulder everything by herself. Caleb had never said anything that crossed the line between friendship and something more, yet his presence felt like sunlight slowly finding its way into a room that had been closed for far too long. One evening, after the bakery had closed, Sarah was wiping down the counter when she realized her phone had died. She sighed. "Oh no." Caleb looked up from his laptop. "What's wrong?" My phone died. And? I need to call my landlord. The water system in my apartment broke today. Caleb immediately stood up. I'll drive you home, Sarah shook her head. You don't have to. You've already helped me enough. Caleb looked at her for a few seconds. Sarah, she looked up. Do you realize that you always refuse help? Sarah froze. She didn't know what to say because he was right. Ever since her divorce, she had tried to handle every problem alone. Not because she was strong, but because she was afraid. Afraid that if she depended on someone again, they would eventually disappear from her life, just like before. Seeing her remain silent, Caleb simply smiled. It's okay. You don't have to answer. Then he added gently, but sometimes you should give other people a chance to help you. During the drive home that night, Sarah barely spoke. Yet Caleb's words stayed in her mind the entire way. A few weeks later, one of the bakery's regular customers suddenly recognized Sarah. The woman had once been a neighbor of Sarah and Brandon. The moment she saw Sarah, she immediately asked loudly, "You're Sarah, aren't you?" Sarah nodded politely. Yes. The woman smiled with obvious curiosity. I heard you got divorced. The bakery suddenly grew quiet. Sarah shifted uncomfortably. That was a long time ago. But the woman seemed completely unaware of how uncomfortable she was making everyone. I remember your husband being very successful. She laughed lightly. Life must be hard for a woman who can't keep her husband. Sarah's face instantly turned pale. Painful memories came rushing back. Just then, a calm voice spoke from behind her. Excuse me. The woman turned around. Caleb was standing there. His expression remained calm, yet there was something in his gaze that made people think twice before arguing with him. I don't think that's an appropriate topic for discussion. The woman looked embarrassed. Caleb continued. She's someone who deserves respect. If you're here to buy pastries, you're welcome to stay. But if you're here to judge someone else's life, perhaps you should leave. The woman's face turned red. Without another word, she quickly walked out of the bakery. Silence returned. Sarah stood frozen. She couldn't remember the last time someone had stood up for her without being asked. That evening, after the bakery had closed, Sarah and Caleb sat outside together. The small street glowed beneath the warm lights of the city. Leona had already gone home. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. Thank you. Caleb turned toward her. For today? Sarah nodded. No one has ever done that for me before. Caleb looked at her with gentle eyes. I think you deserve to be treated far better than the way you've been treated. It was such a simple sentence. Yet it immediately brought tears to Sarah's eyes. She quickly turned away before he could see. Winter arrived, and the bakery organized a small charity sale. Sarah worked from morning until night and was nearly exhausted by the end of the day. While cleaning up, she accidentally dropped a small wooden box she always carried with her. The box popped open when it hit the floor. Inside was an old photograph of her mother. Caleb bent down and picked it up. He looked at the picture before gently handing it back. Is this your mother? Sarah nodded. After a long pause, she finally began telling him everything. She told him about her childhood, the small house she grew up in, the years she spent caring for her sick mother, the gold bracelet she was forced to sell in desperation, the promise she made to live a happy life no matter what happened. It was the first time she had ever told her entire story to another man. Caleb never interrupted. He never offered empty advice or meaningless reassurances. He simply listened. When Sarah finally finished, she realized tears had been running down her face for quite some time. Caleb handed her a tissue. Then he quietly said, I think your mother would be incredibly proud of you. Sarah broke down crying. But this time, the tears were different. They weren't tears of despair. They were tears of being understood, of being heard, of finally sharing a burden she had carried alone for years. In that moment, Sarah no longer felt alone. In the distance, Leona stood by the window of her apartment overlooking the street below. She watched the two young people sitting side by side and smiled to herself. Then she quietly whispered, You two are taking forever. Spring arrived gently that year. The trees in front of the bakery began to sprout fresh green leaves, and Leona's little bakery continued attracting more customers. Sarah had gradually become the heart of the kitchen. Many regular customers didn't even know the owner's name. They simply remembered the woman with the warm smile standing behind the pastry counter. Life finally seemed to be moving in the right direction. Yet deep inside Sarah, one final barrier remained. Fear. The fear of trusting someone again. One weekend afternoon, Leona suddenly called both Sarah and Caleb over. "Are you two free tonight?" Sarah nodded. Caleb did the same. Leona smiled. "Good. I have 2 tickets to an outdoor concert." Sarah looked surprised. "Aren't you going?" Leona shook her head. "I'm too old for that. Sitting outside for hours would probably destroy my back." Caleb gave his mother a suspicious look. He knew perfectly well she was doing this on purpose. But Leona pretended not to notice. In the end, the 2 of them went. The concert was held beside a lake. A cool evening breeze drifted through the air while soft music echoed across the grass. Families and couples sat together enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. Sarah sat beside Caleb. For the first time in a long while, she felt completely at peace. Not the overwhelming kind of happiness she used to chase, just a quiet sense of safety. A feeling Brandon had never given her. In the middle of the performance, Caleb suddenly spoke. "Sarah? If one day..." He stopped himself and laughed awkwardly. "Never mind." Sarah turned toward him. "What were you going to say?" Caleb remained silent for a few seconds before deciding to be honest. "If one day you're ready to move forward." He looked directly at her. "I hope I'm the person standing beside you." Sarah froze. The music seemed to fade into the background. She stared down at her hands while her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it herself. After a long silence, she finally whispered, "I'm scared." Caleb nodded. "I know." Sarah tightened her fingers together. Tears slowly filled her eyes. "I'm scared I'll choose the wrong person again. I trusted Brandon. I trusted him enough to give him my entire youth. I thought he was the last family I had left. But then," her voice broke. Caleb spoke softly. "I'm not Brandon, and you're not the same Sarah you were back then." They looked at each other while a gentle breeze swept across the lake. Sarah didn't answer, but for the first time, she didn't look away. After that night, neither of them mentioned the conversation again. Caleb remained exactly the same as before. He still showed up almost every day. He still helped everyone around him. He still cared about Sarah in the most natural way possible. Somehow, that touched her even more. He never pressured her for an answer. He never made her feel guilty. It was as though he was willing to wait for as long as necessary. Despite being extremely talented in his career, Caleb was surprisingly terrible in the kitchen. One morning, after noticing how hard Sarah and Leona worked every day, he decided to arrive early and make breakfast for both of them. Less than 10 minutes later, the smell of something burning filled the bakery. When Sarah rushed into the kitchen, she found Caleb standing helplessly in front of a blackened frying pan. The sight was so ridiculous that she immediately burst out laughing. Caleb scratched the back of his head awkwardly. Maybe I should stick to engineering. From that day on, Sarah occasionally taught him simple recipes whenever she had time. He learned very slowly, but he always tried his best. Watching him struggle made Sarah realize something important. Caleb wasn't some perfect man she had imagined. He had flaws, weaknesses, and embarrassing moments just like everyone else. Somehow, that made her like him even more. About a month later, Sarah became seriously ill. For years, she had pushed herself beyond her limits, carrying every burden alone. When her body finally gave out, she realized she had been exhausted for a very long time. Leona worried constantly and called several times a day to check on her. Caleb practically stayed by her side the entire time. He cooked porridge, bought medicine, changed cold towels, and even took 2 days off work to care for her. One evening, Sarah woke up in the middle of a fever. She opened her eyes and saw Caleb asleep in a chair beside her bed. The soft yellow light illuminated his tired face. A thermometer was still resting in his hand. In that moment, something warm spread through Sarah's heart. It felt peaceful, safe, genuine. It was the feeling she had always imagined a real home should feel like. Not the kind of love that demanded endless sacrifice until nothing remained, but the kind of love that made a person feel cherished. A week later, Sarah had fully recovered. The bakery closed as usual that evening. Leona had already gone home, leaving only Sarah and Caleb behind. Sarah stood outside the bakery, staring at the distant streetlights. After a long silence, she turned toward him. "Do you remember what you asked me at the concert?" Caleb looked surprised. "I do." Sarah took a deep breath and smiled. It was a gentle smile, but one filled with certainty. "I think," she paused, "I'm ready to move forward." Caleb simply stared at her. His eyes slowly brightened. Sarah laughed softly. If you still want to be the one standing beside me. Never before had she reached out and took a man's hand. Then I want that person to be you. Caleb stood frozen for several seconds before gently squeezing her hand. Outside the bakery window, a car had just pulled up. Leona had returned to pick up a bag she accidentally left behind. But the moment she saw the two of them holding hands, she quietly turned around and walked away. As she wiped away tears of happiness, she whispered to herself, "About time." Later that night, sitting alone in her apartment, Leona looked at a photograph of her husband who had passed away more than 10 years earlier. She smiled softly. "See that?" she whispered. "Our family is about to gain a daughter-in-law." That summer, Leona's little bakery looked very different from the day Sarah first walked through its doors. Back then, only a handful of customers would stop by to buy pastries before quickly leaving. Now, every morning before the bakery even opened, several regular customers were already waiting outside. What made Sarah happiest wasn't the growing number of customers. It was the fact that people had started remembering her name. "Hey, Sarah, do you still have the apple pie today?" "Sarah, that pastry you recommended last time was amazing." "Sarah, have you come up with any new recipes this week?" Those simple questions often left her standing there in silence for a moment. It had been a very long time since she felt recognized, not as someone's wife, not as the person quietly supporting someone else's success, but as Sarah. One evening after closing, Sarah remained in the kitchen. Dozens of recipe notes were spread across the table in front of her. Leona walked in and looked around. "You're still here?" Sarah looked up. "Miss Leona, I'm working on a new idea." Leona pulled out a chair and sat beside her. "Another new pastry?" Sarah nodded. "We've always sold a lot of traditional baked goods, but I keep feeling like something is missing." Leona rested her chin on her hand. "And what exactly are you looking for?" Sarah stared at the pages of recipes for a moment before answering. "Something people will never forget after they taste it." Leona laughed softly. "I think you're starting to sound like a real pastry chef." Over the next several weeks, Sarah devoted nearly all of her free time to experimenting. Some nights she stayed at the bakery until almost midnight. Some days she threw away dozens of failed pastries. Other times, a recipe looked beautiful but tasted terrible. More than once, Caleb found her asleep at the kitchen table surrounded by recipe notes and baking trays. He could only shake his head. "You're pushing yourself too hard," Sarah smiled. "No, I'm not." Then she looked back at her work. "I'm enjoying this." And it was true. For the first time in her life, she had a dream that belonged entirely to her. One afternoon, Sarah was about to throw away another failed batch when Caleb picked one up and took a bite. Sarah laughed immediately. "You really are my personal food trash can." Caleb frowned dramatically. "That sounds awful." Then he took another bite. "But honestly, this one isn't that bad." Sarah quickly grabbed the pastry out of his hand. "Don't eat it. It still isn't good enough." Caleb looked at her for a moment. "Do you know what your problem is?" Sarah blinked. "What? You're too much of a perfectionist." Sarah sat quietly for a few seconds before laughing. Maybe he was right, but she had no desire to stop. Deep down, she felt as though she was getting closer and closer to something important. Several months later, on what seemed like an ordinary morning, Sarah pulled a fresh tray of pastries from the oven. The aroma immediately filled the entire kitchen. The moment Leona caught the scent, she turned around. "Oh my goodness." She took a deep breath. "What is that?" Sarah looked surprised herself. She carefully cut one open and stared at the center. The cream cheese filling slowly flowed out, not too runny, not too thick. Everything seemed almost perfect. Leona was the first person to try it. She closed her eyes for several seconds as she tasted it. Then she opened them and looked directly at Sarah. "This..." Sarah's heart began racing. "What is it?" Leona suddenly laughed. "You little troublemaker." She pointed at the pastry. "I think you finally did it." Sarah stared at the cheesecake in disbelief. After months of testing recipes, throwing away failures, and doubting herself, she finally felt that she had created something special, something that belonged entirely to her. That very same day, Sarah decided to add the new cheesecake to the bakery's menu. At first, only a few customers ordered it out of curiosity. Then, an elderly woman bought 3 boxes to take home. The next day, she returned with 2 friends. After that came another family, then a group of college students. Before long, everyone seemed to be talking about the same thing: Sarah's molten cream cheesecake. Sales didn't explode overnight, but something far more important began to happen. People who tried the cheesecake came back, and when they returned, they usually brought someone else with them. One afternoon, Sarah happened to glance toward the front counter and froze. A small line of customers was waiting to place orders. It wasn't a huge crowd, only 5 or 6 people. Yet she stood there staring for several seconds. Because when she first arrived at this bakery, there were days when hardly anyone came through the door at all. Leona walked over and noticed her expression. "What are you looking at?" Sarah smiled softly. "Everything just feels unreal." Leona followed her gaze toward the customers waiting in line before looking back at her. "There's nothing unreal about it." She gently squeezed Sarah's shoulder. "You've worked hard for 2 years. This is exactly what you deserve." Sarah remained silent. In her mind, images from the past suddenly flashed before her eyes. The park bench where she once slept with nowhere to go. The small suitcase she carried after leaving Brandon's house. The tears she cried while selling her mother's bracelet. The night she was thrown away by the man she loved. If someone had told that version of Sarah that one day she would be standing here, she never would have believed it. But now, she had truly begun to stand on her own feet again. Over the following months, the molten cream cheesecake continued gaining popularity. A nearby coffee shop reached out and asked if they could carry Sarah's pastries alongside their drinks. At first, Sarah hesitated. She worried that the bakery wouldn't be able to handle the additional demand. But Leona encouraged her to take the chance. After the first partnership came a second, then a third. Soon, customers were also placing orders for birthday cakes and family celebrations. Some weeks, Sarah worked late into the night trying to complete every order on time. The bakery eventually hired 2 additional employees to help keep up with demand. The workload became much heavier than before, but this is the first time in her life Sarah felt that all of her effort was finally being rewarded. If the first few weeks had only been small, positive signs, what happened afterward far exceeded anything Sarah had imagined. Her molten cream cheesecake was being talked about more and more. At first, it spread through simple word of mouth between friends. Then, people started posting about it on social media. Soon, short videos filmed by customers began appearing online. No one paid for advertising. No one hired influencers. Everything happened naturally. One evening, as Sarah was preparing to close the bakery, a college student walked in holding her phone. "Are you Sarah?" the young woman asked excitedly. Sarah looked surprised. "Yes, that's me." The student immediately lit up. "Oh my gosh, I finally found this place." "Your cheesecake is all over the internet right now," Sarah blinked. "What do you mean?" The student opened a video on her phone. It showed a cheesecake being cut in half while the cream filling slowly melted out from the center. Beneath the video were thousands of likes and countless comments. Sarah stood frozen. She had never imagined that a pastry she created in a small bakery could attract so much attention. Over the following days, the bakery became noticeably busier. Every morning, customers lined up before opening time. By lunchtime, most of the pastries were already sold out. By afternoon, many people arrived only to find a sign hanging in the window that read, "Sold out for today." Some customers left disappointed. Others placed orders for the following day. Sarah and Leona barely had time to rest. The ovens ran continuously. Fresh trays of pastries disappeared almost as soon as they came out. There were days when Sarah remained on her feet for 12 straight hours. By the time she got home, her legs hurt so badly she barely wanted to take another step. Yet every time she saw the smiles on her customers' faces, she felt it was all worth it. One evening, while reviewing the bakery's records, Leona suddenly removed her glasses and laughed. "What's so funny?" Sarah asked. Leona slid the revenue ledger across the table. "Take a look." Sarah studied the numbers and immediately froze. Their revenue for the month was nearly 4 times higher than the same period the year before. It had even surpassed the bakery's best year on record. I can't believe this," Sarah whispered. Leona smiled. "Neither can I. I've owned this bakery for over 10 years, and I've never seen anything like it." Sarah stared at the numbers. Her eyes slowly filled with tears. She remembered sleeping on a park bench with nowhere to go. She remembered being rejected from job after job. She remembered surviving on little more than bread and water. Those days suddenly felt very far away. Not long afterward, the bakery was forced to hire additional staff. First one employee, then two, then three. The small kitchen that had once felt spacious suddenly became crowded. The ovens ran almost non-stop. One day, the mixer burned out from being used so heavily, and Caleb had to rush out and buy a replacement. Watching everyone running around trying to keep up, Leona felt both proud and concerned. One evening, she asked Sarah to sit down. "Have you ever thought about expanding the bakery?" Sarah looked surprised. "Expanding?" Leona nodded. "This place isn't going to be enough much longer." Sarah slowly looked around the kitchen. This bakery had saved her life. It had given her a job, a family, a future. It had even led her to love again. The thought of changing it made her emotional. Yet she also knew Leona was right. The bakery had entered a completely new chapter. 2 months later, something unexpected happened. A well-known food blogger quietly visited the bakery. He didn't introduce himself or announce who he was. He simply bought a few pastries and left. Sarah had no idea who she had just served. The next morning, Caleb's phone wouldn't stop vibrating. Curious, he opened social media and immediately froze. A review of their bakery had gained hundreds of thousands of views overnight. The blogger had described Sarah's cheesecake as one of the must-try desserts in Dallas. From that moment, everything exploded. Customer traffic nearly doubled. On some days, the line stretched all the way down the block. People drove for hours just to buy a single box of pastries. Some even flew in from other cities. More than once, Sarah stood behind the bakery window staring at the long line of customers waiting patiently outside. It still felt like a dream. Then, one afternoon, while she was working in the kitchen, a professionally dressed woman walked into the bakery. She handed Sarah a business card. "I'm a producer from Startup Rising," she said. "I'd like to interview you and share your story." Sarah stood completely still. There was still flour on her hands. She looked at the card, then at Leona, then at Caleb. No one said a word, but all three of them understood the same thing. Sarah's life was about to enter an entirely new chapter. The filming was scheduled for a Friday morning. The night before, Sarah could barely sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while countless thoughts raced through her mind. If someone had told her 2 years earlier that one day she would appear on television to share her entrepreneurial journey, she would have thought they were crazy. Back then, she had been curled up on a park bench with nowhere to go. No money, no home, no family, no future. Yet now everything was different. The next morning, the entire production crew arrived outside the bakery before sunrise. Cameras, lighting equipment, sound technicians, producers, reporters. The scene was so busy that many customers stopped outside just to watch. The host was a woman in her 40s with a warm smile. After greeting everyone, she walked over and shook Sarah's hand. "I've read your story," she said. "To be honest, it moved me deeply." Sarah smiled awkwardly. "Thank you, but I'm just an ordinary person." The host laughed. "The people behind the most inspiring stories usually say that." Filming lasted almost the entire day. Cameras followed Sarah as she prepared ingredients, kneaded dough, baked pastries, served customers, and chatted with Leona throughout the day. One private interview was filmed in a quiet corner of the bakery. The host looked at Sarah and asked, "If you had to choose the most difficult moment of your life, what would it be?" Sarah remained silent for a few seconds. Her eyes drifted toward the front window. "I think it was the day I was thrown out of my home." The entire production crew became quiet. Sarah continued. "That day I walked away carrying a small suitcase. I didn't know where I would sleep that night. I didn't know how I would survive the next day. But I remembered something my mother told me." Her voice softened. She said that no matter what happened, I had to find a way to live happily. Her voice trembled slightly, but she still smiled. So I just kept moving forward. Later, another segment was filmed in the kitchen. The host asked, "What makes your cheesecake so special?" Sarah laughed softly. "Honestly, I don't think the secret is in the recipe." "Then where is it?" Sarah turned and looked at Leona standing nearby. "It's in the people who helped me get back on my feet. If it weren't for Leona, I would never have made it this far." Leona's eyes immediately filled with tears. She quickly turned away and pretended to clean her glasses. But everyone knew she was crying. When the episode finally aired, the audience far exceeded expectations. The story of a woman who had lost everything, been betrayed, and rebuilt her life from nothing quickly captured public attention. Social media filled with messages of encouragement. Thousands of people shared Sarah's story. Many women saw pieces of themselves reflected in her journey. While Sarah's life continued to improve, Brandon was becoming increasingly obsessed with the stock market. A few early investments had earned him impressive returns, making him believe he possessed a special talent for making money. He constantly bragged about his success to friends and even borrowed additional money to invest more aggressively. Anyone who advised caution was ignored. Brandon was convinced he was destined to become a successful investor. On Sunday morning, Brandon woke up later than usual. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his luxurious house. He stretched comfortably as he climbed out of bed. Although some of his recent investments hadn't gone as planned, he still believed his life was far better than it had been when he was married to Sarah. At least, that was what he kept telling himself. No more listening to what he considered annoying questions about his day. No more seeing a wife constantly moving around the kitchen. No more responsibilities interfering with his freedom. Brandon poured himself a cup of coffee and settled onto the sofa. Every Sunday morning, he liked to watch business programs while drinking coffee. He casually picked up the remote and turned on the television. The moment the screen lit up, Brandon instantly sprayed coffee across the room. Cough! Cough! He nearly dropped the mug as he choked. On the television screen was a face he recognized immediately. Sarah. The woman he had thrown out of his house 2 years earlier with nothing but a small suitcase. The woman he once mocked by saying, "What can you do besides cook?" And now she was being featured on one of the year's most promising startup programs. The host was speaking enthusiastically. Founder of Dallas's famous molten cream cheesecake brand, one of the fastest-growing small businesses in the region, an inspiration to women rebuilding their lives after divorce. Every sentence made Brandon's face darken further. That's impossible. What the hell is going on? He jumped to his feet and stared at the screen. Images flooded back into his mind. Sarah leaving with no money, no assets, no job, no support. According to everything he had predicted, she should have struggled to survive. He had convinced himself that sooner or later she would come back begging for help. That was why he had left her with absolutely nothing. He wanted to prove that she couldn't survive without him. But the woman standing confidently on television had shattered every piece of that arrogance. Brandon felt heat rising in his chest. Not regret. Jealousy. A selfish, ugly jealousy. He wasn't happy for Sarah's success. What infuriated him was the fact that she had succeeded without him. He clenched his jaw. How? How is someone who only knows how to bake ending up on television? Envy twisted his face. Instead of recognizing the effort Sarah had poured into rebuilding her life over the past 2 years, he convinced himself she had simply been lucky, or that someone powerful must have helped her. Deep down, Brandon had never truly believed Sarah was capable. Even now, after seeing her success with his own eyes, he refused to admit he had been wrong. In a burst of rage, Brandon hurled his coffee mug directly at the television. Crash! The screen shattered instantly. Glass scattered across the room. Brandon stood there breathing heavily. Sweat trickled down his forehead. His hands trembled as they curled into fists. Finally, he collapsed onto the sofa. For the first time in 2 years, Brandon felt something slipping away forever. And what hurt him most wasn't Sarah's success. It was the realization that she had proven something he never wanted to accept. She had never needed him in the first place. After watching the television program, Brandon could barely focus on anything else. The image of Sarah sitting confidently during the interview replayed over and over in his mind. What bothered him most wasn't the fact that she had become successful. It was the fact that she looked far happier than she ever had while she was with him. For days, Brandon obsessively searched for information about Sarah's bakery. The more he learned, the more shocked he became. Hundreds of positive reviews. Long lines of customers. Revenue that continued to grow month after month. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Sarah had truly succeeded. One morning, Brandon drove to the bakery himself. The moment he stepped out of his car, he saw a line of customers waiting outside the door. The sight irritated him even more. When he walked inside, he immediately spotted Sarah behind the counter. Her face was bright and full of life, completely different from the exhausted woman he remembered. Sarah noticed him too. The smile on her face disappeared instantly. Silence settled between them. Brandon forced a smile. "Sarah, it's been a long time." Sarah looked at him calmly. What do you need? The coldness in her voice immediately irritated Brandon. Sarah had never spoken to him like that before. He glanced around the bakery. Looks like you're doing very well. Sarah said nothing. Brandon continued. Actually, I came here to talk. I think we should give each other another chance. Sarah stared at him for several seconds before letting out a bitter laugh. Another chance? Brandon nodded. Yes, I know I made mistakes, but now I understand who truly cared about me. Sarah slowly shook her head. No, you don't understand at all. Brandon frowned. What do you mean? Sarah looked directly into his eyes. You couldn't remember the woman who stood beside you for 9 years. You only remembered her after you saw her become successful. Brandon immediately fell silent. Sarah continued. The day you threw me out of the house? Did you ever wonder where I would sleep that night? Did you ever wonder how I would survive? No. The only thing you cared about was getting rid of me as quickly as possible. Brandon couldn't find a single word to say, because everything she said was true. At that moment, Caleb walked into the bakery. He had just finished work and stopped by as he usually did. Brandon immediately recognized him. He was the man who had appeared beside Sarah during the television interview. Caleb stepped forward and stood next to her. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. That simple gesture told Brandon everything he needed to know. Sarah reached over and took Caleb's hand. Then she looked back at Brandon. You should go. My life has nothing to do with you anymore. At that moment, Brandon felt truly defeated. Not because of money, not because of success, but because he had lost the only person who had ever loved him sincerely. And this time, there would be no second chance. After Brandon's visit to the bakery, Sarah never brought up the incident again. She felt as though she had finally closed the door on her past. That man no longer had the power to hurt her. He no longer occupied any place in her heart. Life continued moving forward. The bakery kept growing. Sarah and Leona expanded into the neighboring storefront. More employees were hired. Several coffee shops around the city even reached out, hoping to carry their pastries. Everything seemed to get better with each passing day. Meanwhile, Brandon's life was moving in the exact opposite direction. After his girlfriend left him, he threw himself even deeper into investing, hoping to recover what he had lost. But the more he invested, the more money he lost. Years of savings disappeared. Several stocks collapsed. Loans became a growing burden. For the first time in years, Brandon faced real financial pressure. More than once, he found himself thinking about Sarah. And every time he did, the bitterness only grew stronger. Because deep down, he knew the truth. If Sarah had still been beside him, things might have turned out differently. One afternoon, while Sarah was reviewing business records, Caleb walked over carrying a small piece of paper. Do you remember this place? Sarah looked down. It was the address of the jewelry shop from years ago. She immediately froze. It had been a long time since she had spoken about her mother's bracelet, not because she had forgotten it, but because every time she thought about it, the pain still lingered. Caleb smiled softly. I think it's time. Sarah looked at him as her eyes slowly filled with tears. The next day, the two of them visited the jewelry shop together. The store looked exactly the same. The elderly owner was still sitting behind the counter. He stared at Sarah for several seconds before suddenly recognizing her. The young woman from all those years ago? Sarah nodded emotionally. It's me. The old man smiled. So you finally came back. Sarah glanced around the shop. Her hands tightened instinctively. The bracelet. I'd like to buy it back. The old man slowly disappeared into the back room. A few moments later, he returned carrying a small box. When he opened it, the familiar gold bracelet was still resting inside, carefully preserved, as if it had never left her possession. Sarah burst into tears instantly. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. It felt as though she had reunited with her mother after years of separation. Caleb placed $2,000 on the counter. Please accept this. The old man shook his head. I'll only take $1,000. Caleb looked surprised. But the old man smiled warmly. I promised I would keep it safe for her. I never said I'd sell it back for more. Sarah wiped away her tears. At least let us give you something extra. The old man shook his head again. Young lady, I've spent my entire life making money, but not every day do I get the chance to help someone keep a piece of their memories. Sarah could no longer speak. She simply bowed her head and thanked him again and again. Before they left, the old man glanced at the bracelet on her wrist and smiled. Your mother would be very happy. That single sentence made Sarah cry all over again. Several months later, Sarah and Caleb were married. The wedding was not extravagant, but it was filled with laughter and happiness. Leona cried more than anyone else. Even while Sarah walked down the aisle, she had to keep wiping tears from her eyes. Caleb looked at his mother and laughed. "Mom, are you getting married or am I?" Leona immediately smacked his arm. "Be quiet." The entire room burst into laughter. During the ring ceremony, Sarah instinctively glanced down at the gold bracelet on her wrist. It was the only thing she had carried with her from her old life, and now it was witnessing the happiest chapter of her journey. 1 year later, the sound of children's laughter filled their home. Sarah gave birth to healthy twin boys. One was named after Caleb's late father. The other was named after Sarah's father. One day, while watching the twins sleeping side by side, Sarah found herself thinking about her parents. She remembered the years of hardship, the park bench where she once slept, the small suitcase she carried away from her broken marriage, the endless struggles she had endured. Then she smiled, because she had finally fulfilled the promise she made to her mother. She had built a happy life. In a small town not far from Dallas, Brandon loaded the last few boxes onto a moving truck. The house that had once been his greatest source of pride had been sold to pay off his debts. After a series of disastrous investments, he had no other choice. Standing in the empty house, Brandon suddenly thought about Sarah. He remembered the woman who used to wait for him with dinner every night, the woman who stood beside him during the hardest years of his life. But now she was nothing more than a memory. The truck slowly pulled away from the neighborhood. Brandon looked into the rearview mirror one last time. He had lost many things, but the greatest loss of all was realizing Sarah's worth only after she had become part of someone else's life. And this time, there would never be another chance to make things right. Finally, Sarah kept the promise she had made to her mother. She would live a truly happy life. She had sacrificed the best years of her youth to care for the man she loved, never once complaining or asking for anything in return. All she ever hoped for was to be loved, protected, and cherished. Sadly, she chose the wrong person. But then Caleb and Leona entered her life and proved that good people do exist. As long as we keep a kind heart, refuse to give up, and continue moving forward no matter how difficult life becomes, there will always be hope. Sometimes life takes away things we hold dear, but in time, it also finds a way to heal our wounds and make up for what we have lost. Somewhere high above, Sarah's parents were surely smiling with peace in their hearts. Their little girl no longer had to face life's hardships alone, and at last, she had found the happiness they had always wished for her.